a show of hands to see who are all here. Okay. So quick recap. So SDA Skills has been operating pretty much in effect from 2010. We were like operating under different names, but from 2017 we are now pretty regular. We are in one of the libraries or the other. Every weekend we practice interview questions, we practice design, and every now and then we have sessions such as like resume reviews and how to optimize your resume. And today the session is around what do you do during an interview. And this is more a super interactive session. I do have like a template of what I want to follow. If you don't have the handouts, there's a handout at the end of the sheet, just end of the table, just go grab one. And what I want to do is walk through this, but again, just because we have a format, I don't want us to restrict ourselves to this. Please feel free to ask questions. This is the more you participate, the more I think we'll learn from this. And I also want to tap into the collective experience of this group. I think we definitely have a ton of interviewing experience as a candidate or as an interviewer in different forms. So let's actually dig into that and start also kind of mapping out what are the different behavior patterns that would essentially be successful. So that's kind of what the goal is. We do have what we also do is, as a part of our coding sessions and our design sessions and other sessions, we do expect folks to we expect folks to come in and present. This is entirely a volunteer-driven, volunteer-led session. We've had loads of people who have actually spent some time walking through these different topics and whatnot. And what I've actually found is, while it's great to participate in sessions, it's even better if you're actually delivering these sessions, because the concepts are like super cemented in your mind. So please make sure that if you can, and no pressure. So there's a 90-minute session, usually an hour or so. Don't feel compelled to run the entire session. You can always come in, spend like maybe one question, walk in prepared with a question, and then we are a friendly bunch, no pressure. So we will always help you with providing feedback and answers. Okay. All right, with that, let's get going. So what I wanted to cover was today what we will do is, we've talked about everything from interview strategies around how do you prepare for interviews, how do you build a roadmap for your interviews, what kind of questions you prepare, what topics. So we've done that side of it in the past, and we'll repeat it at some point of time as well. But today what I wanted to focus on was like during the interview, you've got about 1 hour if you are at a phone interview or so, 45 minutes an hour depending on which company. And you're also trying to either that, or you're also on-site interview setup where you actually have like 4, 5, 6, 7 at times people interviewing you. You may have different things such as like a group discussion. You may have events where you have like a panel interview where you have like 3 or 4 people in a panel interviewing you, or you may have just a one-on-one style interview. Multiple companies, like different companies have their own styles of actually running interviews, interview sessions, and the purpose is different, and what they're trying to get out of it is different. So what we're trying to focus on today is 2 key aspects. So one is I want to focus on the on-site interview, which is essentially maybe before that let me quickly disambiguate. There is a phone interview and then there is an on-site interview. The goal of a phone interview is typically it's a process of elimination. As a company, the company's goal is to make sure that they're not wasting your time, they're not wasting their time. On-site interviews are expensive. You are probably, in many cases, you end up meeting like 10 people, 8 people, 5 people, whatever that number is. And then in many, many scenarios, you're also flown into the new city. So if someone in New York wants to come and interview in the Bay Area, you have to, book tickets for them. It's very disruptive even for the candidates. So in order to make sure that the candidate experience is all right, you just want to make sure that there's a minimum guarantee of what to expect from the candidate at that point of time. So that's what the phone interviews are for. The goal of the phone interview is not to predict your eventual success in the company, but the goal of the phone interview is just to predict your eventual success in the interviews. So it's a second order problem. Not just like the goal is not to figure out like, hey, will this person be successful at the company or not? It's just around figuring out if you're good at will you be able to clear the interview bar or not. But here's another aspect of it. They usually look at failure patterns of prior on-site interviews and they tweak it. Like one of the common examples is, this is not for coding interviews, but for people management interviews. Most common question is people who have not effectively managed people, and they've just been like, a team lead or something like that. Like they control the work of the people, but they don't really deal with hiring and firing and coaching and growing. Right? That aspect they don't do. They too they do reasonably well in phone interviews because you talk to them, you talk about technology, you talk about delivery, it's all great. They come in on site, you talk about like, hey, how do you think about coaching, how do you think about growing, and they're like, I have no idea. And this happens interview after interview, and then you go back and tweak the phone interview process, to figure out, like, the failure pattern for most people who did this was this, and that's why we need to fix this. So based on that, that's how you tweak your phone interview process. So if you're a company and you're trying to fix your phone interview process to optimize, let me ask another question. What happens if 100% of your candidates who are coming through the phone interview are successful in your on-site interviews? Does that mean that your phone interview process is effective? Like, you have 0 failure rates. Like, everybody who makes it through the phone interview makes it through the on-site as well.
It's a little too effective.
Is there such a thing as 2 effective phone interviews?
I don't know. Yeah.
Too stringent phone.
Your phone interviews are too stringent. Like, what it means is that you are probably refusing a whole bunch of candidates who might have otherwise made it through. Your phone interview is an error-prone process. You know that. You can't really trust that process as much, right? If you have a 100% success rate after your phone interviews, then the controls that you have in your phone interview are probably too tight. You may want to either relax it or skip the on-site entirely. I mean, if you have a 100% rate, then why not just deal with it, right? So why bother? I mean, if your phone interview is that great, then you can completely eliminate one step and move on. It's the same thing with, like, resume screening, for example. Like, if I screen resumes, and if I find that 100% of the people whom I screen resume in are actually going through the phone interview, it either means one of two things. Either my resume screening is too stringent, or my phone interview is too lax. In any part of any funnel, right? If you're looking at a sales funnel at any part of time, you do have everything from, like, lead generation to lead qualification to all the other steps and conversion finally. You are expecting drop off at every stage. That is the whole purpose of that stage. If the drop off rate is 0 at some point of time, that means that step is useless, or that just means that the previous step or the next step is actually kind of blending into what happens in this step. Okay, so that's kind of where we are with this. So let's jump in. Let's jump into what happens in an on-site then. So we talked about phone interviews, right? So what happens in on-sites? On-site is it's the reverse problem at this point, and contrary to what people may believe, the goal of the on-site is to actually select people and not reject people. Most companies are actually looking for qualities to select people, not looking for opportunities to eliminate them. So if there are multiple coding interviews and you don't do well in one coding interview but you do well in the 2 other interviews, more likely than not you will be selected. Like, at least if you're not selected, then the coding is not the reason why you will not be selected. So we are looking for data points typically to identify whether, like, have you demonstrated success in the following 15 items is what we're trying to look at. And the data point might come from interview 1 or from interview 2 or from interview 3, because the reason why you failed coding in interview number 2 is probably something else. It's got nothing to do with your coding skills, because you have demonstrated your coding skills in interview 1 and interview 3. So why would you exclude people based on that? Okay? So, but that's not the feeling that I get when I'm actually the candidate anywhere and I look at this. It almost feels like the interviewers are out there to get me, and they're like trying to do gotcha, you're wrong here again or something. It sounds like a power trip. It sounds like that, and it's natural to feel that way. But trust me, I mean, that's most companies are actually working towards eliminating that aspect of it as much as possible. While the interactions may sound that way, it absolutely is not. The goal of the company is to select you at that point of time, identify items where you're making great progress. Now let's actually play the coding thing as well. Let's assume that you bombed 2 coding interviews and you did reasonably well or amazingly well on one of them. And let's assume that everything else was okay, and coding was the only vector with which you want to make a decision. Do you think you've made it or not? Maybe not. Maybe not. Because the thing is that now you're looking at what is the goal of the interview is to predict more likely than not this person will do an amazing job coding. Now I have 2 data points that tell me that they've failed on various items, and we have to probably go and disambiguate why. Like, you failed on item number 1 because you didn't do a good job of this. You failed on item number 2 because it was like immediately after lunch and you were probably half asleep or whatever. I mean, you have to walk through, give them the credit, give them the feedback and whatever necessary accommodations that you have, and then you come back and say, yeah, you know what, more likely than not, it makes sense or not, right? So that's where we are with that. So if you look at the top half, so this sheet essentially covers like exactly what I'm kind of looking to cover today, and I may speak through most of it, but if not, feel free to bring it up as questions. So what I wanted to primarily focus on was 2 things. One was essentially whiteboarding and how you think about whiteboarding and what you need to do. How many of you actually feel that you are amazing at a whiteboard session? Like, I would be surprised to see any hands go up, including mine, because while I have actually written I've done a lot of whiteboard sessions, and I actually use whiteboard for active facilitation during design discussions, during code discussions at work. There are a lot of things that I kind of miss. And there are, like any other systems, there are like actually best practices. So one thing to note is that typically if you look at most interview setup, your whiteboard is essentially in landscape. But very rarely the whiteboard is in portrait. And the way you actually think about how to use the whiteboard actually varies between landscape and portrait. So let me just use the landscape mode for now in this discussion, and then we can see how we can flip it around for portrait as well. So if you, there's like a small little image that I have there, and what I recommend in general is that when you are actually going through your interview process, just partition the whiteboard into like logical space. And essentially the left 2/3 of the space is like the solution space, and the right 2/3 is essentially the problem space of sorts. Like it's the where you write the problem, the assumptions, the test cases, and things like that. One of the recommendations is that, since you have the full whiteboard available to you, just write the problems in one line at the top. Like, what are we trying to do? Am I trying to build a library management system, or am I trying to build something? What is the goal, right? Write the goal right up top. Start as left, as high as you can. If you're vertically challenged like me, then you may not be able to use the full whiteboard space. So go reach as high up as possible, and then you just have to do it only once to write the problem statement, and then you don't have to do anything else. So that's one of the reasons why I do that first, is because that's probably the easiest way for me to use the topmost real estate that I have. I don't want to be at my toes throughout the entire interview trying to write code and whatnot up there, right? So this is like, do the stretch the first few minutes and then just make that problem statement done, and then that portion of the whiteboard is gone. I don't care about it anymore. I'll just refer back to it as often as I can. It's also a good way to visually level set at what the problem you're trying to solve is. So done with that. Then the second thing I do is on the far right 1/3 of the board-ish, feel free to draw the lines if you think you actually will struggle with that partition. There is a downside to that. And feel free to not draw the line and essentially go roughly to the 1/3, right 1/3, and then start writing there. If you draw the line, that tells the interviewer that you are actively thinking about whiteboard management. It's not like natural, but it's something that you know what you're doing, that this is my partition, this is my space, and it's essentially you're just being very structured and methodical about it. It's still a learned habit and not like an innate habit at this point of time. So it's better to be a little bit more loosey-goosey with that, because it also gives you the flexibility to do other things depending on how the problem evolves. Drawing rigid boundaries makes it a little bit harder. But that being said, so I would prefer just winging it, go roughly to the 1/3, and then go deep. So what do I have there? So that's where I kind of note down keywords, assumptions, clarifications, like what are the input things that is expected of me, what are the output that's expected of me, and things like that. Just go through that, get that going. Finish that, and then you go to the far left of the board. That's when you start, and now you're actually venturing into the solutions segment. And the solution is essentially, again, you have the left 2/3 of the board, roughly divided into half, and one half of it is essentially the left 1/3 is where you start the solution space. Here's where you're brainstorming, here's where you're drawing your system diagrams, sequence diagrams, whatever that makes sense, like pseudocode, algorithm, depending on what type of problem it is, that's kind of where you're brainstorming all of that, right? Done with that, and then you venture into the middle segment, which is exactly where that's the meat of your solution, and that's where you're writing your answers, and that's what you're doing. That's where the code is. And once you're done with code, number 5 is to again go back to the right of it, which is where you've looked at the assumptions and clarifications and whatever else, input and output. Just do a solution verification. Just find out if what you've done makes sense. Like test the code, and then check off the test cases and things like that, and that actually will get you to the holistic answer, and that gives you the full picture. Now what this does, in my opinion, this is one of the ways of doing it. There are different structures. I mean, nothing prevents you from going right to left, left to right, top to bottom. You could write the problem statement at the bottom of the whiteboard. I mean, you could do whatever that makes sense to you and whatever is logical partitioning. But this approach works in certain ways. So number 1 is that if you're not structured with your whiteboard, then what happens is that you are constantly erasing things to make space for other pieces, and then you will have to go back at times. Like, what was the problem statement again, or what was that assumption that we talked about? Like, how many users? Is it 1 million or 1 billion or 10 million? The numbers sometimes are a little bit of a blur. So, and if you misremember it in the subsequent setup, it actually causes more trouble than it's worth. So it's not as effective, and it's just easy to have it right there. So that's number 1. Number 2 is that the interviewers are also looking to take notes as a part of this activity. So if you have the entire thing laid out, and it's like that's the final output of your interview. They can just take a picture and then they can move on. That has everything. No need to erase, no need to do anything else. If you're, for whatever it is worth, if you're writing a lot of code and you have figured out that, well, I've written enough code, I need to write one more function and I need some space. Now I have the choice of actually either erasing the assumption string on the far right or the solution definition on the far left. I don't know which one needs to go, right? Obviously, it doesn't make sense to erase the code that you've already just written and then rewrite it. You can probably pick and choose which one you want to erase. But the more you kind of figure out, like, the objective is which one you don't need it in the interview and which one you don't want, or you don't necessarily mind the interviewer not recalling as a part of the feedback. So if you've done a fantastic job of requirement clarification, don't erase that, because I want the interviewer to take away. At the end of the interview, when they take a picture of the whiteboard or when they're looking at the whiteboard, I want that to be there in front of their in front of their faces, like all the time, right? So think of it as whatever you're doing should be deliberate and purpose oriented. So you want to know why you're doing that, right? So the whole logical organization arrangement is just for that. Few quick tips is, of course, handwriting on a whiteboard. Unfortunately, most of us are typing these days. So I remember, like, I've been asked to write pages and pages of handwriting when I was a kid, and I always hated that. But then now I think I can see how that's actually coming into effect. But again, don't use cursive. Cursive is actually barely legible on a whiteboard. Print, as in just use block capitals and just print individual letters. That's easier. If you don't know or if you're not used to it, do it. Try to figure out how that works and then make it happen. The other one that I learned as a part of my first consulting engagement was actually use two colors. Have two markers in your hand, like black and blue, and then, or like red and green, or whatever that is, two colors. And then when you're writing things, write the first line in one color and write the second line in another color. Now this is super, it's a big tax on your brain to kind of figure out what color I use and what not. But then if you're actually doing that in your day job, and anytime you head to a whiteboard, like, take two markers, both markers right in your hand, and when I'm just writing, I write it automatically, I cap this marker, I take the next one, I don't even think about it. It's something that's very natural, right? If you have seen some of my sessions, and I think you can probably go back to YouTube and see it, like, I don't even talk about it, but I've done that. You have seen alternate colors in like black and blue or something pretty often. That's not a deal breaker, that's not something that's absolutely essential, but there have been cases when I've done that at work, in my current company, and then people look at it and say, it's like an amazing impression around, wow, that makes so much sense, and it's so much clearer, so much easier to follow, and things like that. So again, very small thing. It's a habit. If you build it, great. If you don't build it, that's okay.
Is it, like you were saying, like you're writing a program and each and every line?
Not program,
okay.
So only for bullet items. So typically for requirement clarity, thank you.
Okay.
Code, ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right? It's going to be a waste of it. Thank you. No, that's what I meant. But I have never written code with multiple lines in different colors. I have not done that, but now that you mentioned that, I'm trying to think of how it will actually be. It might be more impactful. I haven't tried it myself. But typically when I'm capturing next steps in a meeting, when I'm capturing test cases, when I'm capturing like assumptions, clarifications, right? I write it in different colors because they're all bulleted items. So that's easier that way. Like when I'm doing capacity planning, on the left side I'm writing down, this is what it means, this is what it means, right? So usually I write in different colors, but it's interesting to see. I will probably try writing code in different lines to see how that works out. I have seldom had opportunities to write code on whiteboard in the last year or so. So I will try that and see how that works out. But I absolutely encourage you to try that as well. It is a big tax on your brain. Just to kind of, so given an interview is already complicated, given that you're already thinking of like 1,000 things, adding multicolored whiteboard thing is probably will have the least impact and probably be the highest tax on your brain. But in time, this is probably the one that will actually be an automatic thing. Just like how you would know to cap a whiteboard thing. Now you know that you need to pick an eraser to erase a whiteboard thing instead of like just rubbing with your hands and things like that. These are like small habits that you pick up, and that just is natural. And once it goes into that innate skill territory, then this is an amazing skill to have. And it's a skill to have in general, not just for interviewing, right? Write and print legibly is good. The next one is actually Goldilocks font size. What about font size? How far do you think is an interviewer in a typical interview? Like that far or this far? Probably like the first feet, right? So how big do you need to write it? Like if you actually write it pretty much in like 10 point, 11 point font, then you have to be like right close up to it to read it. But if you're writing it like reasonably big, like yay big in terms of your letters, it's probably okay. But what if you write a little larger than that? Then you will run out of space. And once you run out of space, what do? You have to erase, and now you have to choose what to jettison. And that's not easy. So that's why there is like the Goldilocks thing, where not too little, not too big, just right. And you will have to upscale or downscale that based on what you think. Like it depends on whether you have like an 8x10 whiteboard or a 6x4 whiteboard. You may have to think about it. If you are vertically challenged, then you really don't have half the whiteboard on the top. So that's another story. So you have to think about how it works. And there are also things like I've seen whiteboard real estate is already premium, and I've seen people like stick business rules and something else on it. Like here's how you write an effective meeting. There's like a A3 size sheet stuck in the corner of the whiteboard. Like, dude, already the whiteboard is so small. Why are you wasting precious real estate? Like stick it on the wall. Don't waste my whiteboard space. So just be aware of what the whiteboard looks like and just use it. Now, again, start top left. The margins, like be mindful of the margins, because one of the worst things to have seen people do is start right in the middle, writing code, and then they finish it, they finish all the lines, and then they go to the left, finish the rest, and then they go to the right and finish the remaining code pieces and whatnot. So even if you have the partition, even in that partitioned area, try to start as left and as top as you can, but as long as it's logically reasonable. Just be aware of the space. And strike, don't erase. So if you make a mistake, if you said something around, like I think there are like 1 million users, and then you say, no, let's say it's 2 million, not 1. It's tempting to erase the 1 and then make it a 2, which is okay. The other thing is just like strike it off and write a 2. To me, striking is easier, faster, and it is also not confusing. So that way it's also visually right there. Even when you're like debugging a code at the end of after you're done with the code, right? You're like debugging it, and then you figure out that, hey, you should have been like a less than equal to instead of like a greater than equals or something like that. Then what I would do is I'd like circle what I made, put a cross through it, and then write the new thing on top of it or just around it. The reason that is that it actually makes it super clear. Otherwise, if you erase and rewrite, there's always smudges here and there. Whiteboards are crappy, whiteboard markers are crappy. I don't know where they make them, but I've never seen that effectively work in many cases. So while erasing works, I would just recommend strike and write, as the case may be. Now, how many of you actually have access to a whiteboard that you can reasonably spend time practicing? Most of you? What do you do if you don't have an access to a whiteboard? Like how do you deal with it? Like I don't have a whiteboard right now, or like we don't have a whiteboard today. Now let's assume that you want to practice whiteboard thing. That's your whiteboard. Imagine this is your whiteboard, the pen is your marker, do the partitioning, go, right? Nothing stops you from actually organizing your thoughts in the same pattern, same segment, because what you're trying to build is you're trying to build that muscle memory of saying, if I have to write the problem statement, it has to go in the top left. If I have to write assumptions, it has to go in the far right. Now, as you're going through the solutioning, you may actually come up with one more clarification. What do you do with that clarification? Go deposit it where it belongs, right? On the right-hand 1/3 of the segment. And as methodical as you can be with it is actually going to give you a lot more impact, right? So that's on the whiteboard. I mean, whiteboard management I'm just like overemphasizing to some extent here, because that's sort of least emphasized. People don't talk about it as much, and it makes a huge difference in an interview.
Well, at one point, bring your own markers. I was in an interview the other day, and morning markers there, came back after lunch, they've been taken. So, and, right at the beginning of the technical part, so I pulled it out.
That's actually good. So that was one of the points I had here, saying bring your own markers, and I took it away.
Yeah.
Why I took it away? Let me tell you why. So the thing is that, so one of the things I do as an interviewer is that, so the way interviews are assigned to me is that go to floor 5, go to room number 162, and then go meet John, right? That's how the interview is given to me. And then I have no idea whether there's whiteboard. I don't even know if there's a whiteboard there. It could be like a casual conference room where it's just like 2 couches and like whatever, single seaters and some table, or there's a whiteboard. Most rooms have whiteboard. So what I do is that I carry A3 sheets with me, the big ones, the 2 twice of A4 ones, and I also carry a marker and an eraser just in case. Because sometimes the room doesn't have marker and sometimes it's there. So as an interviewer, I go prepared to just make this work. And so far in about the last year, I have used it only once for the marker and twice for the paper. That's it. No more than that. So but it's still like worth the preparation, and it's almost natural. The marker is always in my backpack. I actually have it because I use it in the session as well. So if I don't have markers, and if I have my office laptop bag, I have it here. That bag I think has like a dozen markers in it already. So always be prepared. So it makes sense. The only risk I run into is that different companies are super sensitive about what kind of markers you use. Some markers actually don't work so well on whiteboards. Like if you have like a high, like acetone-free markers are what they use, and if you have acetone in your marker, it causes issues. It kind of like etches or leaches out the whiteboard space. So there's like a whole bunch of different things, and sometimes they have issues with that. So I added that as a recommendation. I'm like, I don't know if I want to have that, and took it away. But it's definitely a good recommendation. Like have the markers that makes sense. One thing that actually when I was impressed was that I had one of the candidates actually bring in one of those fine point markers. These are like pencil-like or pen-like markers, and they're like easy. So she was able to write the code much better with it, and it was reasonably legible because it was like super dark black marker, and it just made sense. To me, that was actually reasonably effective. Like a typical chisel tip marker is actually much bigger. It's very hard to write code with that, especially if you go in all directions, right? It just doesn't work. So I thought the fine tip marker thing was actually an interesting setup. So my opinion is not, I didn't have my opinion made on whether I want to recommend people to bring in their own markers or not. But I've seen it helpful. I've also seen it, certain companies actually push back on some of those things. So be mindful, but that's a great tip.
Another thing I've seen is of late, after every interview, especially a coding one, the interviewer wants to take a pic of the code. So sometimes I end up erasing a portion of it, and then that's not there.
Yep. So yes, so again, once you have finished the interview, and once you're about to, it's a good practice to erase the whiteboard, start clean for the next interview, because you want to start with a clean slate, makes sense. But then, before you erase, check with the interviewer. Like, can I get rid of this now? And sure, that makes sense. So usually the interviewers want to take the picture before that, any questions for me, and then they walk away. In most cases, I've had candidates come back and say, hey, do you want to take pictures or something? I'm like, no, I'm good. I've taken down the code. I've gotten what I wanted, so I didn't need pictures for that. So it's fine. It doesn't hurt asking. The whiteboard, I mean, you're preparing the whiteboard for, like, it's a presentation, right? So why not make the most of it? Like, encourage them and invite them to take a picture so that it actually is more effective for you. Okay? Good point. Go ahead.
So sometimes I've seen they can offer like a laptop for you to write a code. So you have a whiteboard where you can just explain, have the assumptions, and you have an option of using a laptop. So
yes. So what do you do? So what do you do if you're given access to a laptop and you could write your code in the laptop and you still have a whiteboard available? What can you do? Like, you can completely ignore the whiteboard, go to the laptop, deal with it. That's fantastic. That's fine as well. Or you could play best of both worlds, where you can actually use the whiteboard for everything except the coding section, and then your whiteboard partition is different, right? You wouldn't partition it this way because you don't need the space in the middle for that. So you may want to use it for something else. You may leave that middle space for testing, or you may want to just test on the code the way it is on the laptop. So again, it is a subjective choice. You may feel like it might make more sense to do both, or maybe more distracting for you, and you may choose not to, and you may just write your assumptions and comments as code comments in your code snippet itself. Like, as you're having a discussion, I've seen people write, like, put 2 slashes and then write whatever they want, as like whatever the discussion is, they just capture it right there, like all assumptions, clarifications, and everything else. And that's worked very well for many. Okay?
A quick note on that. If it's your laptop, that helps. If it is the company's laptop, it might not work for you. So in my case, my laptop didn't catch the Wi-Fi of the company.
Oh no.
And I was given their loaner laptop, and it was a new system for me. So I ended up coding a non-optimal solution because I didn't know the system, like what's in there.
Right.
And they needed to capture the code, so Wi-Fi connection was needed.
So they needed the code anyway. So yeah.
but in my case, I just feel they might give you like an text editor that just some kind of like highlighting. And
even little things like the keyboard layout, the
it
size of the length of the keys.
Like,
because I have muscle memory, I can touch type without looking at the keyboard. But you give me a brand new thing, I'm gonna write like random crap.
Like writing on whiteboard, bunch of code versus writing it on.
I'm way faster. Even if I'm like looking at the keyboard and typing, I'll be faster on a keyboard. Is what I feel. And keyboard also offers you the ability to edit, insert lines and things, and change your mind on certain aspects of it. So I am more comfortable with a keyboard and that, but again, many places offer you that opportunity, some places don't, so you have to think about how you want to play that. Now, it is worth talking to the recruiter before the interviews about how this is going to be set up, so that gives you an opportunity to game plan, have a game plan for this. If not, you will probably go there and at runtime you're deciding like, hey, I have my laptop here, I have this, should I use it, should I not use it? And then you may pick something that may or may not be as effective, right? But great points all over. I mean, I think this is exactly what I'm looking for. I'm looking for like, people have been through whiteboard interviews, you've been stuck in so many different places. It's annoying, but that's how it is. And one of the questions that I've been asked multiple times, like, why whiteboard? I'm not going to write code on whiteboard, but why are you making me do that? You actually write a bunch of things on a whiteboard. Like when you're explaining concepts, when you're doing system design, a whiteboard is a fantastic tool. How does it work how do you do whiteboard interviews over a VC or a video conference? How do you do whiteboard interviews when the candidate is, like when the interviewer is somewhere else and you're there? I've seen scenarios where they point the camera at the whiteboard, which doesn't really work. Then we mark out the corners, saying, oh, you can see this corner, you can see that corner. So your whiteboard is not the entire whiteboard is visible, but like only a part of the whiteboard is visible. It's just super annoying, but it's a skill that is worth developing. If not for interviews, but even for professional work life, you will actually use your whiteboard skills in so many different forms. Okay? All right. So let's actually now jump into the next, like the main part of the thing. Just do a quick time check. Yeah, we should be alright. So the big part of the thing is that I wanted to actually see what is a checklist. Like, how do you go through the interview, the entire interview process? This is it. Like you walk into the interview and the interviewer says like, hi, I'm John. I've been with this company Foo for like 20 years and I manage the space and let's go, right? Let's start with the interview. So what are the things that you need at that point? What do you do? How do you kick off the interview? So there are a couple of things to think of. Number one is there is this thing called, how many of you know what primacy and recency effects are? Primacy effect, recency effect. Primacy effect is essentially when you say first impression is the best impression. That's essentially primacy effect. Primacy effect is you retain what was the first interaction that you have. So it's very important to open with a strong, like it has to have a strong opening in the interview. If you mess it up, it's okay, you can redeem yourself, but it's always good to do that. That's the primacy effect. The recency effect is that you actually take away what happened last as well. So somewhere in the middle is always a blur. They remember what happened in the beginning. They remember that, hey, that person was like amazing. Great impression, looked good, firm handshake, sounded like as if they knew what they were talking about. And then throughout the course of the interview, you know what, you might have actually said some things, done some things that are not so ideal. But towards the end of the interview, if you finish strong, then that actually gives you a little bit of a leg up. So that's the recency effect there. So that's the fact, that's what happens. So now how do you play that to your advantage? It's essentially, in your interview, plan around it. So the first thing that happens in most cases, in most interviews, is they ask you to introduce yourself. And they ask you to tell me about yourself or tell me more. Certain companies have now stopped doing some of that because they want to get beyond the prepared speeches. And I have questions for you and I'm going to ask, like, you know, in your resume, line number 4, you said that you did this amazing thing, just tell me more about that. And they focus on specifics instead of asking you, like, hey, introduce yourself in a few words, right? But I've seen many companies do that still. So it doesn't hurt to have that elevator pitch prepared for you. An elevator pitch is essentially what you can actually say during an elevator ride, reasonably fast ones, not super slow. So the expectation is that you have somewhere between 25 seconds to about 55, 60 seconds to essentially communicate whatever it is. An elevator pitch is a concept that's used for multiple things, like if you're talking about your startup idea, if you're talking about like what you want to accomplish in life, if you're talking about like, you know, your strengths, your weaknesses, you can always come up with, this is my elevator pitch. And the elevator pitch is your opportunity in an uninterrupted fashion, probably spit out somewhere between 30 to 75 words, depending on how fast you speak, and that's about it. Practice your elevator pitches, the words have to flow, and you cannot stutter, stammer, stop in between, or use the wrong word. Like, no, I actually meant advantage, not advancement, or whatever. You can't do that. Like, it has to be like a very clean, flowing conversation. And it's your elevator pitch. There's like a sample elevator pitch here, which is essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to introduce yourself. My name is such and such. This is the company I work for. I've been in this particular domain or space for a few years. That's the basic thing. And then you actually that's your introduce. Then you summarize your experience. So that way they have a way to anchor what you're doing. And then you highlight your skills. It's like, I'm good at this, and I walk on water. I do this. I've gotten a few patents. Whatever is your highlight, whatever is your stick, right? It could be, it's very personal. prepare the elevator pitch, practice with your friends, practice in front of a mirror, use a camera if you want to, record yourself actually doing the elevator pitch, and then the more you do it, the more natural it will be. Like if you, like for SDE skills, I keep talking about, like SDE skills is a non-profit organization. We did this, we started at this point in time, this is what we do, and I am trying to figure out what is it that I want you guys to take away. At the end of the elevator pitch, right, there's only a few things that whoever you're delivering it to will take away. So you need to start figuring out what is it that I want to highlight. You don't want to use complicated words. You don't want to use like abstract things. You don't want to say that, oh, we actually are the perfect system between temporal stochastic model. You've lost me. I have no idea what you're talking about, right? Don't use domain-specific terms unless you feel that the interviewer or the participant can figure it out. Don't use acronyms. Don't use. So keep it simple, as vanilla as possible. And this is like, again, this is the equivalent to the explain to your grandma what you do or something like that, right? So it needs to be very, very simple, very, very distilled. And you still have to have the ability to talk about what your skills are, and your strengths essentially, and what are you expecting? What are your wants? What is your expectation? And that's it. No, not a difficult task, right? Only like 70 words at most. And you have to pack everything from introducing yourself to your experience, to your skills, to what you want. And so hard stuff, you may want to figure out if you want to leave out one of them, like, I don't want to summarize my skills because I'm just looking at, let me just do strengths, not my experience, or experience but not skills, not strengths, because I really don't know what will be valued. I'm a software dev manager, what more do you want? Like, if imagine a random arbitrary software dev manager, I'll probably do every one of the things that you talked about. So it doesn't make sense for me to say, I'm good at people management, I do program management, I do product management. I'm just like, don't regurgitate or repeat the title that you own, like the skill, the responsibilities of the title. You have to talk about your accomplishments. So you would actually have to talk about, like, I have a team of 20 people or 50 people, I have launched this product and things like that. It has to be very personal and achievement, accomplishment oriented, right? So I'm kind of like condensing the elevator pitch. I've had, in the past, I've seen elevator pitch workshop being run with an entire 2-hour session dedicated to here's all the things that go into an elevator pitch, and then let people go and write their elevator pitches, and then exchange with each other, and then figure out how to optimize it, and then you tear it apart, rebuild it. So I've seen people do that. So I'm kind of trying to over enthusiastically trying to shrink like a 2-hour session into like a 5-minute capsule. So go ahead, you got a question.
Will it not be a redundancy when I am speaking on my skills and the interviewer already has that in my CV written? So
Which is exactly why you sometimes not the skill, but the experience. There are 3 parts to it, right? The skill is essentially what you want to highlight, and the CV has a bunch of different things. The experience, like the fact that I'm a dev manager with so many years of experience at company foo, is something they can glean from the resume. So that's like a waste of like 8 words, which I could have used for something else. So you have to essentially, if you know the old joke of this fresh fish sold here, you got to do that with this. You have to go eliminate every word that doesn't make sense, every word that is automatic, assumed, implied. Just eliminate that, like, involve, like, remove fillers, remove, I mostly work on, like, why mostly? Just say I work on, and things like that, right? So you have to get rid of words that don't make sense. Every word that you chisel out is essentially an opportunity for you to spend, do something else, and try to keep it less than like 45-50 seconds or so, right?
I have a question. So these days, I want to highlight my scenario, what I'm trying to do, and then probably I want to understand how to put it in a proper way. So I work on microservices, and then but the past few months the focus has been shifted towards CI/CD pipeline, which is mostly making sure how we build our services from the third-party software to a homegrown product. So when I'm in this mode for some time, and I really like what I'm doing in the CI/CD pipeline stuff, using homegrown tools, can I still highlight that I'm a developer working on microservices, and then I did have an experience that I started working using CI, integrating my service with CI/CD pipeline, so that we can ship the service to production environment.
So I don't know if you folks heard what she said, but let me just repeat a few parts of what you said and then ask a question. So I'm a developer, I'm working on microservices, and off late I've actually I'm working on using homegrown tools to integrate existing services using a CI/CD pipeline, and that's what I've been doing, something to that effect, right? Any concerns with this as an elevator pitch? It's not powerful enough. You need to rework on a bunch of things because it's just like randomly said a few words, and that's where we are, right? So it's not gone through even one iteration of actually cleaning it up. So this is great from a content standpoint, but in terms of how you're presenting it, what are the couple of things that you noticed?
Too generic.
It sounds very generic. Like I still don't understand like why would you be effective at what, and what did you accomplish is not yet coming out at all. So we need that accomplishment bits are very good catch. Anything else? Another angle of what you said was also the things like I am working on microservices is different from like I am an expert in microservices versus I build and deploy microservices. So it's like the working essentially is very generic term, which essentially is more like talks about your responsibility as opposed to your accomplishments. So the same rules that apply to your resume in terms of using the power words and things like that also apply to your elevator pitch. Elevator pitch is more like a tweet format of your resume. So you have to think about how that actually applies. So my feedback here, and I don't want to switch this session to an elevator pitch refinement session, but at the same time, the way I would rephrase that is to say that what do you first walk with, what do you want the interviewer to take away, what do you want the listener to take away? To take away that saying that I am someone who has actually has been working on microservices for quite a while. All right, I know how to build, deploy, and deliver microservices. That's one. Not just in one architecture, but multiple architectures. And I also have the capability to essentially build it in a continuous deployment, click to deploy latency is actually something that I'm super sensitive about, and I have specialization in that space, like CI/CD space, right? So I did also not point out that CI/CD. You know what CI/CD is? Continuous integration, continuous deployment. So people may not know, right? So that's a challenge. So be careful, and this is like the bunch here. Almost everybody knows what continuous integration is. Everybody knows what continuous deployment is, but they may not be familiar with the word CI/CD. I think Vidya was actually talking about CI/CD as well, and she dropped a few lines on what CI/CD was. But anyway, so be careful about that. So what I would do is work backwards from what you want the focus to be. The focus is just this, right? So then I'd write my elevator pitch based on that. Then essentially dividing my elevator pitch into one half which is essentially lead in, the second half which is to essentially close, right? So how do you plan a session? You lead into the session, you kind of bring the interviewer to the right context or frame of mind. So I didn't hear the number of years of experience, so would be helpful, because once I hear like I have 10 years of experience, my approach is different from when I hear I have 6 months of experience, which is different. So there's a little bit of like you need to drop your credibility, like draw your credibility somehow. Like maybe having a master's in computer science from a popular university is your lead in to the credibility. Maybe working in a top tier company is your credibility, or maybe having a patent is your credibility. Like whatever that is, right? You have to drop that in, because that essentially is the hook that gets them into the conversation. Once they are in the conversation, now you have to go full throttle to the close. That's all we're looking at, right? It's a very sounds a little like sales-y, but it is. At the end of the day, you are actually doing a sales pitch, and you are the product in this case. So it's your job to represent your skills and qualities in the most effective way. All right.
Just a quick question. Is it a negative to say, I have more than 20 years experience? I feel like nowadays that's negative. I try to actually downplay that.
Yes.
I try on my resume, I don't go my full.
Mm-hmm. Is that a negative if I actually were to say that I have like 2 decades of experience, or I have 20 years of experience, or whatever? Like, is that a negative? Is that a positive? Maybe not. It largely depends on the place you are in, what you're trying to get to, and things like that. Ageism is a concern. People are actually there are biases which people have. Some of them are very conscious biases where they're actively discriminating based on like, oh, this cool, great, this cool, terrible. They already have that in their mind. And in some cases, it's a very subconscious bias. Like, oh, this company, people from that company always do this, or something like that. Like, they are known to be slow or whatever else. So they have bias against companies where they're coming from, bias against cities where they're from. Like, I have no idea, oh, Midwest, oh, they're like this way. I'm like, no, that's not how it works. Sometimes these biases are subconscious, and in the interview side of the training, we talk about how do you actually identify and recognize these conscious biases, and how do you actually recognize these unconscious biases, they call it, and what are the techniques you use to interrupt the bias, like, how do you drive the data, like, oh, that guy is awesome because he works in Microsoft, he has worked in Microsoft for 10 years, something, that's great, but where's the data that's powering that? So we ask that kind of a question to go see if we have data, or are we making an assumption based on inaccurate data points. So age bias, gender bias, these are all biases which exist. Bias against communities at times also exist. Bias against companies exist. Localities exist. Countries exist. And in some scenarios, you might be better off not highlighting that.
Yeah, maybe I'll frame the question slightly differently. Like what I tend to do in my elevator pitch, which has worked fairly well, is I don't overemphasize on how many years experience I have. I try to emphasize on my skills and what the things that I've been working on, what I've done, what I've accomplished. So I try to emphasize that rather than, oh, I got 21 years at this company.
So if you have 6 months of experience, you don't want to emphasize your experience.
Right.
If you have 3 to 6, 8, 10 years of experience, maybe you might want to emphasize that. If you have 10 plus years of experience, you may have a different way of emphasizing your strengths and not put the number. Because if you put a number beyond a point, it actually will probably trigger the other side of the negative side of it. Which is the same thing with also, if you're picking like legacy and archaic technologies, if you were to say like, oh, I can actually program like a ZX Sinclair in my sleep, right? Great, but I don't know how that actually helps. So things like, so may not want to think about certain technologies. Again, the goal here is to optimize for impact. Right? You got a question?
So I had a problem when I say I have 4 years experience in systems because they push me into that kind of a role even if I want to change domains. So especially like when I'm giving an elevator pitch to the recruiter, especially not even at the interview stage. So the kind of roles that they offer to you is completely dependent on what kind of things you focus on.
So which is why, so the point was that if I'm a systems engineer, or if I'm, again, this happens very often with SDETs, software development engineers in test, who want to reinvent themselves in the production engineering or support engineering or something else. I want to move away from testing domain. Like testing domain is great, I did a good job there, but I want to reinvent myself as a software engineer. Now, if my elevator pitch is like, I have 4 years of experience in software testing, then guess what kind of roles they're going to offer you. Guess what they're going to map you to. It's going to be the same roles. So you might want to, again, your elevator pitch is customized towards, like focuses on impact. So what do I want the interviewer to leave with, or what do I want the recruiter to leave with? I want them to understand that I'm a strong engineer with a whole bunch of skills looking to reinvent myself or looking to get a role in development. At no point of time I'm even dropping the word test. The test is there in the resume. They can figure it out. But since I've not even mentioned the word test anywhere, or support engineering or something else, or production engineering, system engineering, I've not mentioned any of that, there is lesser opportunity for them to typecast, and that's what I would do. Which goes back to the age as well the same way. If you make a statement, you want to make sure that those phrases are actually having the right impact. That's one of the reasons why you want to actually have somebody else also review it, especially people either who are recruiters, hiring managers and whatnot to look at it, because sometimes when you say a statement like, I have 25 years of experience, it might sound great when you say it, but then you may want to have somebody else saying, like, hey, that could be interpreted as this, and this could have a negative impact like this, right? So that aspect is something that you may get somebody else who is experienced in this domain can help you with. So that's kind of where you need to, that's where the workshops for this comes in handy. So let me move on. If you have any more questions, I can take one more question. If not, we can move on.
So about being a generalist, I mean, I think that's something that proud myself to be, but I'm curious if that can play against me if I present myself, my skills that I know a lot. I know about a lot of things, but not like something super deep. I don't know, would you have any concern about that?
So not an elevator pitch conversation, but mostly a resume conversation as well. One of the challenges you have is that many folks that I know actually pride themselves being generalists. Like, I'm a jack of all trades. I know a whole bunch of things about a whole bunch of systems. I've actually worked on Linux, Windows, Mac OS. I've also worked on C, C++, Java, and Ruby. It doesn't matter. I absorb technologies fast. I learn quickly. I'm effective immediately. But on the hindsight, on the counter part of it is that you don't want to put me in restructuring the kernel module in some C thing, because I may not be the best engineer for that. I'm in for the broad strokes. I'm great. I'm quick. I deliver well. But very specific things, hyper optimization of some things, I may not be effective. And that's kind of the space you want to play in. Now the risk that you run into is that you're actually definitely alienating yourself from a bunch of jobs. The advantage that you're getting is that you're actually putting yourself in the contention for a lot of jobs. Now, if I have a Java expert and you, who's got like a generalist feel, the Java expert will probably get a better sense of it. So generalists are at a disadvantage. While you actually, your role is applicable to a wide range of openings. Like if I were to say that there are like 1 million jobs that are open, being a generalist actually puts you in the running for like half of it. But you are actually in lower priority because there are 10,000 Java specialists, 10,000 Ruby specialists, 10,000 this, and then they're all better than you when it comes to just a specific role, right? And that's the space that you're playing with. So you need to somehow augment that and offset that. Like somehow you have to get to a point of saying, it is better to hire me than that guy who actually is a Ruby specialist for this Ruby job. Because, and you need to have an answer for it. My answer there is essentially to say that you're doing Ruby today, but you're doing something else later. You can always hire a Ruby expert as a contractor to get this job one and done. You need to be looking for like, we are in a constantly shifting space, and like companies, like big ones, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, pick any of these guys. They want people to be constantly on their toes, switching technologies, domains. I mean, Microsoft was not in the online space for quite a while, and they were building Word. And then the market changed, and now they're doing Word online. So you look at the kind of technology they're working with, it's no longer like, you know, that team is now doing a lot more of like UI, front end, React, and whatever else. And that's not something that, it's very hard to reinvent yourself, especially if you're in that, if you're very stuck in a particular domain. And most interviewers kind of know that, but you need to also walk with that mindset. Don't try to play the game where you actually don't have the advantage. Change the game to a conversation of what are the different technologies that you guys are working on. So when you're in an interview, I'm jumping ahead, like any questions for me would be to say, what other technologies are you actually working on? Like what is the diversity, what's the mix? Because I want to impress to the interviewer that you're not just like, you don't want a one-trick pony. You're not looking at that guy who's like amazing at Ruby and is terrible at everything else. You want someone who can reasonably get the job done in Ruby, doesn't have to be the best, but has the skills for this, and this. And look at my resume, I've got all of that, right? So you need to change the conversation that actually maps to, like, flip the conversation to your advantage. Not an easy task, but that should be your game plan. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right, let me move ahead, and then I know elevator pitch was supposed to be a minute in the actual elevator pitch, and I was supposed to take about 10 minutes for it, but it'll take a minute longer than that, which is okay. Now, the couple of things to keep in mind, like the interview as such, right? The interview process is not it's not a request response. It's not a question answer session. So it's not where I ask a question as an interviewer, you're answering as a candidate, and that's it, right? It's just not that. It's not even just the interview question, answer, follow up, and whatnot. You can't really put a sequence diagram around an interview session, right? It doesn't make sense. So it's a little bit more of the journey is more important than the final destination. Whether it's a coding interview, design interview, or whatnot, it's a thought process. Because at the end of the day, the interviewer is not here to extract your subject matter expertise from you. It's not about like, for example, if I give you the question, that was a thing I started off initially, I give you a question, you go sit silently for 15 minutes, and then like spit out the answer in like 10 seconds, is that good enough? Like, no. What I want is the actual journey. The journey is a lot more meaningful, a lot more important, because I'm not trying to hire you to do that specific thing that we covered in the interview. I'm hiring you to do a bunch of activities for which I'm building the confidence that you can do the job through the interview process. As you're answering my interview questions, as you're actually managing me, managing my expectations, and managing me as an interviewer, I can get a window into how you're thinking about technology, how you're thinking about the problem space, how you're actually thinking about requirement clarification and things like that. So it's absolutely important to connect with the interviewer. Now, one of the things that we teach the interviewers is that people actually come with different personality types. So you have people who are like loud and outspoken, people who talk before they think, and then you have people who actually think but don't talk, and introverted. The different like personality traits that people have there, and we don't want their individual personality skill to actually affect the outcome of an interview. But the reality is that people who are more outspoken and people who are loud, people who are actually very articulate, actually tend to perform better in interviews. Primarily, purely because they actually have a better throughput. They can get more information across. They can actually more effectively communicate what they want. And you might be an amazing candidate, but you don't know how to communicate your strengths. doesn't really do you much good, right? So it is unfortunate, and by and large, I know a lot of people, and specifically in the tech domain, tend not to speak a lot, tend to keep a low profile, tend not to stand up in front of a crowd and speak and things like that. So, shameless plug for SDE skills, an opportunity for you to come in front of the group and essentially present an interview question and handle this with multiple people is a fantastic way to actually flex that muscle. It's a friendly bunch. It's a very good way of actually building that. So if you're even remotely considering standing up here and then presenting a topic, do that, because that's what's going to give you the easiest way to get away from that stage fright, get away from like, what if I say something incorrect and whatnot. Like, believe me, the interviewer has got every possible answer for whatever they're asking, and it could range from completely idiotic, doesn't even make sense, to all the way to amazing thing. And possibly in some cases you may actually even raise the bar by giving a particular view that they have not seen at all, like a question and ask. Like one of the questions that I very often ask is like a game question, and in that game question you need to do level 1, level 2, you have to take multiple decisions at a time. And it's a very simple decision. Each decision is independent and it should just work. And I was interviewing a senior engineer and I was asking him like, hey, how do you take the first decision? Here's all the data that's given to you. And he's like, does it actually make sense to sub-optimize decision 1 to optimize decision 2 and 3? I'm like, I have no idea. Let's think about it again. And then we spent some time, and then it turns out that he was right. And logically it made sense. And I said, yeah, don't worry about it now. Let's just focus on one decision at a time and move on. But then I go back, and I'm actually working this out, and I am preparing test data for my question to say, can I actually sub-optimize question 1 and have 2 and 3 better in this decision tree? And there are examples like that. It took me like a couple of hours to figure it out, and there's no chance I would have figured that out in the interview. But to me, that was like a way of like thinking, which I thought like, hey, this is like a guy who's actually thinking about like the entire decision tree, not just the first step and the second step. So it was more illuminating, but I think we ended up hiring that person. So number 1 is connect. So make sure that you are listening to everything the interviewer is saying. More often than not, the interviewers have actually done this like so many times that they have actually, the information density in any communication from an interviewer will be typically super high. In the sense that they're very precise in their wording. The goal of an interviewer is to introduce enough ambiguity in a question. So if I will not actually give you a question where design a warehouse management system where I have 1 million packages and 100,000 addresses, and I give you this, right? So the way I phrase the question, I have done it like hundreds of times, or like tens of times at least, if not more. And as I get feedback from the candidates, I understand where people get confused. I kind of refine my wordings, and so just like how you're tweaking elevator pitches, people are tweaking their questioning styles as well, right? And they do that. So whatever they're saying is actually precisely engineered to give the information to you. And a typical normal information density that you expect in a typical conversation will not hold good. The information density is way higher in an interview. So what you need to do is pay attention to every word, which is not what we do normally. When you are when you're reading text, when you're reading phrases, when you're reading books, right? You have a way of like, you read snapshots. You just read the first word, the last word, and you kind of make up things in between, and you kind of fill in the blanks with a bunch of things. And that attitude and that behavior, that learned behavior that we have, is going to be a bad thing for you. So focus on the information density, listen to every word. One of the things that helped me was that I have a notepad with me, and then I write down words or keywords that the interviewer is throwing at me. Or in a meeting where I know that this is that, right? And think of it this way, so in a presentation, when somebody's presenting, someone who's like super knowledgeable about a field and they're talking about it, I want to write down everything that they say, like a couple of words, keywords, underline and things like that. Because the information density, like even in this session, right? The information density that you expect is much higher than a typical conversation. Primarily because I have actually worked through the conversations, figured out which ones are actually ineffective pieces, I've eliminated them. This is not the first time I'm delivering this session. So I kind of know what connects, what doesn't connect, and things like that. Now, the typical retention is actually very low from sessions. I think it's in double digits if you're lucky, and single digits in most cases. Like people, when you walk away without any notes or anything, you only retain about like 5%, 6% of the session is, I think, the official number. But then, but if you write down things and things like that, and then you revise it after like a couple of days or a couple of hours or whatever that frequency is for you, then your retention goes into like mid double digits, like 30% or so. No good way for you to increase the retention to higher. So in an interview, you want to keep everything the interviewer says. So if you're on the whiteboard and you're looking at the clarification, assumptions, input-output section, as you're discussing, you could just go and write, and then like, drop the bullet points and the important elements there, so that you can always come back and revisit. If you're using a notepad and paper, do that as well. That also works really effectively. Okay? So that's on the connect.
To me, on the whole page, this particular bullet was the most important one, so I wanted to comment and question. A couple weeks ago, a bunch of us who were in Redmond Library doing system design, we did the short referral thing, right? So we talked about like having a system to answer some of these questions, right? And I like that system. I like that meetup that we had. We talked, through the various steps of functional, non-functional, API, data structures, and so on and so forth. So I was in a technical interview recently, and I tried to apply that system because I thought it was a good system. So the problem was, and it didn't work out at all for me. The reason was because I didn't listen well enough to the interviewer. And so what happened was he wanted something very specific from me, right? So I started designing that. I talked about assumptions, but he only wanted one piece of that, right? And I kept trying to go back to an overall solution, which was a framework, right? But I didn't double click enough, what he
specifically what they
wanted, right? So,
fantastic.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, it's good, and I think it's important. I think it's helpful to have these systems in place when you go in, because it gives you a framework or guideline. But on the other hand, you have to at some point in time go to what they want, right? Because I think there's two kinds of interviewers. There's some that are very good that come with 2 pens to an interview, and they come with all their stuff ready to go. And there's others that just don't know what the hell they're doing, right? They just make some shit up, and they have some answer in their head, right? And you're just guessing. You're like, I wonder what this guy wants to say.
Fair enough.
So let's talk about that second guy, right? Because that's who I was against, right? He was the second guy, and I tried to use a system, but I couldn't read his mind because I didn't ask enough questions or connect enough with him.
Let me repeat what you just said, and then go and so one of the challenges he had was, the way I heard it at least, or the way I internalized it, is that if you go in super prepared with a template, with a structure, with a format, right? This is what I want to do, and then you're super rigid about what you're in your mind. That's a fantastic framework that covers 90% or 95% of the use cases that you have. But then you will have, and Murphy's law, it'll be the 5% that happens with you, is when the interviewer is in that other 5%. And they're specifically looking for one technology, one tool, one answer, one thing, and your broad framework that you've gone in is not as effective. And if I were to essentially go, and one of the cases is that I think a common misconception is Google wants graph interview questions. And then if you just say, if you try to make every question a graph question, won't work, especially if the question is something completely different, right? So what you want to think about, and the way you have to think about it is regardless of what tools you have, what frameworks you have, listening attentively to what the interviewer wants, and then essentially having a shared understanding and context of what the interviewer is looking for and what you're providing is absolutely important. Even when we did the system design question, one of the things that we emphasized in the beginning was system design could be a system design, it could be an OO design, it could be an architecture question, it could be a coding question, which is masquerading as a system design because they want you to do a high-level system design and code one piece of it. And if you spend the entire time asking questions and clarifications and designing a fantastic big system with large scale and everything else, it won't work well for you because that's not what the interviewer is looking for. So it's very important to early on figure out what the interviewers are what's the output that is required. If I look at, I think I had it somewhere here, and which is basically, finish the question is where I dropped it in, which was basically saying, just confirm that you have solved it. In order for you to confirm that you have solved it, you need to know what solve actually means. What does the interviewer want? It's I'm guessing a number, I'm thinking of a number, just guess it for me, or something like that? Or is it here is a problem for which Dijkstra's is the only meaningful solution and that's all I want? Or here's a graph problem for which there are multiple solutions, I just want you to think about how you're doing it. Some of these questions are very pointed and they just want you to give a specific answer. And you would recognize that immediately as you're actually having these question answer sessions with them, saying, so I can think of it in a few different ways. And you have to play the interviewer or talk about the interview with the interviewer. One of the mock interview sessions that I had seen recently, where the interviewer actually asked a question to the candidate, saying it's a mock interview. So unfortunately, one of the downsides of a mock interview is that you don't have a good brief. The interviewer was not told what to look for. The interviewer was not told to say, here are the competencies I want. I want you to go figure out if they can deal with assumptions, deal with this, like solve problems, right? That brief was not given to the interviewer, which essentially meant that the interviewer was like just flying by the seat of the pants. Just like asking whatever, and whatever clarification question you ask, like, yeah, go for it, that's what I'm looking at. And that was a very poor interview, because the candidate could not figure out what the interviewer wanted. And then that was the post-interview discussion with the candidate and giving the candidate coaching. We go through, like, what do you think? What do you think went wrong? It's like, I spent 15 minutes trying to figure out what the interviewer wanted, and I couldn't figure out. Like, I didn't know if he wanted a system design, or he wanted architecture, or code. I was not clear to me. Like, I understand the problem. I understand the problem space, but I don't know what the output was. And I was just like kind of, randomly doing the spaghetti approach, like throw it at the wall, see what sticks. And that's it, that's what I was doing. And finally I came up with something. So then the interviewer confessed, saying, yeah, I didn't have a good game plan in mind myself, and that's what the issue was. So you can't always assume that your interviewer will actually have a game plan, or if they have a game plan, they may actually have a game plan which is very rigid, in which case what you've done here, you can just throw it away, and then you have to completely do a different approach.
Yeah,
this approach is
takeaway from that was just to be able to pivot quickly.
Listen, first 5 minutes, listen, understand, and connect with the interviewer, understand what the expected output is. And then make sure that you're hanging on to every word that the interviewer is saying, because the information density is way more than what you normally expect. A few tips that is there is like, as you go through the questions, understand and repeat the question just to kind of make sure that you've heard it right. It's one fantastic way of actually also further optimizing. This is like there's a three-way handshake, right? So you tell me the question, I repeat the question back to you. If you understand the question the same way, then fine. So the data transfer is actually fully established. It's like a read, verify after you write kind of equivalent system here. So you play it back and say, is that what you're looking for? And then in this case, you can also extrapolate a little bit more, and then that gets you what you want. And in some cases, you can also shape the conversation towards what you would like to do. For example, if you want to do a system design and not an object-oriented design, if the interviewer is ambivalent about it and provides a feedback, you could say, hey, so you're looking at me designing a system that does this and this. And then the interviewer more likely say, yeah, fine, go ahead with it. Because it's much harder for them to go back and say, no, I want you to do an OO design, right? So if they do it, that's great as well. But if they're ambivalent, it gives you an opportunity to snoop in and get there. The next one we've talked about this multiple times. Always make sure that you're asking clarifying questions and balance clarifying questions with assumptions. There is a thing as asking too many clarifying questions, and the clarifying questions have to make sense, and you have to ask the right clarifying questions at the right time. As you're walking through the problem-solving path, each question you ask has to take you to different directions, and the more meaningful your question is, the more directional change it will have, right? So asking a question of saying like, will you deploy the solution in Apache or Nginx is not as useful, because like, why does it matter? Like, I'm asking you to design a Ticketmaster system. The fact that you're using these two technologies has like zero or less than zero bearing on what you're going to design. So why? Right? It doesn't make sense. So making sure that you're asking the right clarifying questions is useful, and it has to. The interviewer will guess based on like, where are you going with this? Like, why are you asking me this question? And if the question is in line with what they expect, then that'll actually do you well. So ask clarifying questions. Again, there's a balance. Some of it is better to actually make assumptions. Like you would say, I'm going to assume it's 1 million users. I'm going to assume that it's this, right? Give the interviewer an opportunity to state the assumption so that the interviewer can correct it if it's wrong, as opposed to asking a question because you're saying, hey, how many users should I design this for? If you ask me, I'm going to throw it back to you saying, like, what do you think? This is like a ticket reservation system. So what do you think? How many people do you think will be using it? So why not skip that step? Just go for it, right? And if you're wrong, if you're designing for a scale of 1 million, and they want it like in 100 million, that's fine, they can correct it. So hopefully you're only somewhat off. Yeah, actually I have it here. The level set on the expected deliverables of the interview. That was the point that I was actually trying to look for when I was saying that. So I want to make sure that this is the phase where I want to make sure that I am super clear as to what the interviewer wants out of it. And if I don't know, if it's just a number that he or she is having in her head, then fine, that's the expectation. And I have no idea how to get there, but I'll wing it, I'll figure it out. But if not, I need to get to that point. If I don't know what is expected, then I'm going to be meandering all over the place. The biggest challenge or risks that I've seen here is multiple interviews. My eventual output is the code, not the design. The design is just an artifact that happens in the process. If I don't get code at the end of it, I have failed the interview as an interviewer, not as a candidate. As an interviewer, I have failed in my job to assess your coding skills because I didn't get code. Now, that is why we teach the interviewers to have milestones to make sure that you get to the right spot at the right steps. And if you don't, then I will forcibly get you there. Like if you are completely, out of place, you have no idea what the design looks like, and you're like struggling with it, I'll come and help you with the design. We'll co-collaborate and get to the design, right? And that will happen probably in the 25-minute mark because I want to give you about 15 minutes to do the code, and then like we have about 5 or 10 more minutes at the end to discuss anything that you want to. Define specific the inputs and outputs. Why is this relevant? Why do you need inputs and outputs, like coding question or whatnot? As long as the code is clear, why do we have to specifically look at the test data? At least like a sample test data, set of test data. Why is it important?
When you walk through it, you may be missing something which you can find yourself.
The test data is actually is unambiguous. It's very clear. This is the input. This is the output. Like if I were to give you a question to some extent around saying, given a number, I want you to print all its factors, right? That's all I've said. Now it's not clear whether you wanted prime factors or you want all factors. Or it's obvious but not obvious. In my head, I probably thought prime. I probably said prime. You probably didn't get it.
I feel like a common example, like just taking FizzBuzz for example. They give you the number, and sometimes you might think, oh, you should just one output, and sometimes they want an array instead.
Yep, there you go.
Or maybe they just want you to print it out. I mean, these are all very important.
Absolutely. So the depending, I mean, in this particular example, like both the examples that I gave and the one that you're giving, we're talking about a very simple, trivial coding question. And as a part of the coding question, the output is everything. Like if you do the wrong thing, like in a FizzBuzz or in the factorizing thing, then it doesn't get you anywhere. But whereas even in a slightly elevated model, if you're looking at like a design, system design, or like a ticket master, which is another common interview question, you want to actually work from the customer journey backwards. So you want to talk about what is the customer experience. The customer walks in and does this, goes to a website, logs in, clicks this, buys a ticket, and that's it. And then that's the journey, right? And once you're done with the design, you have to walk through the journey again to actually make sure that what you've done actually satisfies the need. Very rarely it actually does not. And the interviewer will actually know when it does not because they've seen the design, they've seen almost all variations of it, so they will know why it won't work. Like specifically FizzBuzz, I have seen scenarios where people like kind of misorder. They're like, I think if I remember correctly, there are about, in simple Java, there are 11 ways you can actually mess up FizzBuzz. So, what is FizzBuzz? If you don't know what FizzBuzz is, look it up. It's a fantastic interview question. And then I think there's probably a blog out there as well that tells you the 11 different ways you can mess up FizzBuzz. It's a very simple question. The question is very well defined. There's absolutely no chance. Input is clear, output is clear. You have to go write the question. There's absolutely no way you can make a mistake if you know what you're doing. And I've seen otherwise smart, intelligent people who know how to code, right? Mess it up in 11 different ways. So. And we can talk about it in one of the sessions if we need to.
I have one question on this input-output thing, and this is from the perspective of online exams. So sometimes you end up solving a question and you know that's the, you at least think that that's the most efficient way to do it. But there are a few test cases before submission when you run them. There are 2 or 3 test cases that time out. So, I mean, is it essential to make sure that at least you can't see those test cases, you don't know what they are, but something timed out, which tells you that you either went into an infinite loop or it is inefficient. So is it worthwhile spending more time on that or move forward with the exam?
So I would go with functional verifications first. So the basic test cases that you have, the simple ones is the first one. And then once you're done with the basic functional verification, which is like, factors, for example. Pick a number, what are its factors, and you can print all of them, and it's good. Then I go to the exceptions or the weird cases where I talk about like negative numbers, I talk about like, prime numbers, I talk about perfect powers and things like that, just to kind of make sure that you got that right. Okay. Then comes the cases of like, what if there is a number with like 1 million factors? How are you actually dealing with it? And these large cases and things like that would be the last one in my list, right? So that's the order in which I'd go. Now, in an interview, whiteboard interview, you would typically not face the time never exceeded thing. But in a written assessment or online assessments, you most likely will see that. When you see that, what it means is that your algorithm is either not efficient or you think it's efficient and it's not. Like a very common use case is that if you do a string manipulation which is in place, it is considered O of 1. If you actually do a string manipulation in Java, even if you're actually changing the 7th character to something else, it's a O of n operation. Why? Because Java strings are immutable. So which means that you're actually creating a clone of the string and then you're actually making the update. And now, in your mind of minds, you're looking at this algorithm and saying, yeah, it's O of 1, I'm good, right? But it's not. It actually is O of n. And that means that while the algorithm is right, some of the specific coding practices that you use is not right. Like you should probably use a string builder instead of string. And this happens very commonly in building permutations as you go, right? You could pass a string prefix and you're doing just like tons of string concatenation. So don't over-optimize for that. It doesn't make sense. But I think if you're specifically working on competitive programming, these are the things that will do you in. And these are not as much of a deal in interviews. But if you're already at like A and you want to go to A+, these are the things that I would look for. Okay. All right. Let me move on quickly, and then I also want to leave some time for you guys to ask questions. So, all right. So let me run to the next one. Now this is the working through the interview question, right? So again, as I said, you could be quiet, you could be working things in your head, and you really want the space, you want to think through it. It is okay to actually let the interviewer know that, hey, you know what? Give me 2 minutes. Let me just think through this, and then do it. Finish that 2 minutes. Like time box it. Keep it very small. I don't want you to be thinking on your own for like any more than 2, maybe 3 minutes tops. The silence is deafening. That's one problem. And the interviewer will actually zone out, which is a bad thing. And the thing is that you want to you want to think through it because you are extrapolating. You're trying to figure out, should I do this approach or this approach or this approach? And you don't want to reveal that to the interviewer yet, right? So take that time. But once you're done with that activity, once 2 minutes have passed, once 3 minutes have passed, you want to now bring the interviewer in on the conversation. Your interviewer is your co-conspirator in the whole journey. You want to bring the interviewer along with you, take them through the entire journey of your thought process of what you thought when the question was given to you and how did you arrive at the decision of using what design pattern, what process and everything else. So you want to take them with you in that journey. The faster or the sooner you're able to keep, the longer you're able to keep them with you, the better and more effective your interview is. Now, there's 2 expectations pieces here. One is, how do you actually do well in an interview? And that is a completely different activity. That's like build the right skills and do all the things that we talked about, get to these sessions, learn more, practice more, and everything else. Second thing is, how do you accurately represent your strengths and your skills and your weaknesses and whatnot to the interviewer so that the interviewer can assess whether what you're doing is good enough for whatever they're looking for, right? So the goal of this session today is to kind of make sure that you are increasing the bandwidth of communication between you and the interviewer. How do I tell the interviewer everything I know? And how do I make sure that the data is communicated in a as error-free or as minimum transformation as possible? So this goal is, I have to tell the interviewer, I have to bring the interviewer through my decision-making process. If your decision-making process is not effective, it's not good, you don't understand what's going on, then the second part of the interview is successful, which means you have successfully told an interviewer that you have no idea what you're doing. But the first half of it is not good because you have no idea what you're doing. So we need to separate these 2 problems. Okay, just remember that. So this session and the tips that we're talking about here are purely about how do I make sure that I can tell the interviewer everything I know, or like have an accurate assessment. That's all we're looking at. On the interviewer side, the interviewers are also given coaching, and most effective companies do this, to improve this bandwidth as well. Like we don't want to miss out on a candidate because the candidate has poor interviewing skills. I want to reject or select candidates based on their skills, technical skills and functional skills, not based on their interviewing skills. And poor interviewing skills usually adds a lot more randomization to this. So trying to figure out how to optimize that is what we're trying to get to. So, few things just to walk through it. Talk through your design and code. The journey is more important than the destination, so the final output is not as relevant as the process that you've taken to go get there. And when you're actually talking about it, try not to ramble. Again, your goal is to get the information to the interviewer. So clear, concise, and being like precise with the phrasing.
I have a question here.
No?
So it says that the journey is more important than the destination. So the expectation in an online interview is to get compilable code, right? That is working. Is that
On-site interviews.
Yeah, in online test. Like they want working code that
So,
compiles, right?
absolutely. So let me stop you there. So if you're looking at online assessments,
Yeah.
there the destination is the only thing that matters. The journey is irrelevant, and in many cases you don't even see it. It's usually an automated system that actually assesses your code, evaluates you, and then says like, yeah, it's big O of n or whatever else, and then they spit out like a red, green, blue, yellow kind of a grade for you, and then you based on that they will choose to interview or not. If you are in the yellow category or the red category or something, they may choose to have another like manual inspection done to just kind of see why was it wrong, and then they may actually go look at it. Most of the online assessments actually has like a code replay function. I don't have 45 minutes or 90 minutes, that's how much time you had, to actually just watch you type, right? It actually tells you, goes through the process. There is a 20x button, which I can click, which will speed up the whole process like 20 times. But still a 40-minute or 90-minute thing essentially is still 20x is what? Just 4.5 minutes of stuff that's happening. And it's actually reasonably uninteresting. The only reason why I look at that code play is to kind of see whether you have actually cheated by copy pasting code from somewhere else. Something. That's the only time I've actually seen the code evolution. Doesn't help because I don't know what your thought process is. It's missing the personal connect aspect of it. Online assessments, journey is not relevant at all. The destination is
So opposite to the whiteboard.
Whiteboard coding, phone interviews, journey is the one that's paramount. Does that make sense?
So they want to see our thought process. It's okay if we don't, if our solution is not working, like in a whiteboard question, if we are not there to the solution.
Let me play that thing back to you. So if I have two candidates, both having perfect articulation, clear, concise, and precise, they've done that. One of them has solved the question, one of them has not solved the question. I'm going to pick the one who solved the question. But if I have two different candidates, both have solved the question, and one of them has actually taken me through the journey and the process, and the other one has just spit out the answer, I'm going to pick the one who's actually provided me the feedback and this. Now if I look at the fourth quadrant, which is basically I have someone who has actually given me the perfect answer, no communication whatsoever, and someone who's actually not given me the answer but reasonable degree of confidence and communication. And I know that this person will reach the answer because of the confidence I have, I'll probably pick the one with more communication. So between the best of course is solve and communicate, but in my opinion when I rank it, solve and communicate is of course number one, communicate but didn't solve is number two, as long as I have the confidence that they'll reach the end point. And then the next one is like no communicate, don't solve. Of course the last one is like don't communicate, don't solve. So that is definitely the last one. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's at least in my head, but the situation can change a little based on what I'm looking for. Like if I'm assessing your coding skills and you don't say anything and you just simply write perfect code based on what it is, I'm probably fine with it. So there's a little bit of subjectivity there. So it's not as cut and dry as that. Okay, I'm just like making a little bit of, I'm stating it as if it's like this is the rule, but I mean there's a lot of variations around this.
Maybe based on the interviewer, right? Everyone
Correct. It's based on the interviewer, it's based on the company, it's based on the competency that's assigned to me, it's based on what I'm looking for, and it's also based on, I definitely need the ability for you to communicate. So as long as the communication aspect of it is covered in a different interview, I'm fine with that. And the skill for this communication might be less relevant in a coding interview, more relevant in a design interview. So there's a lot of different ifs and buts to it. So I don't think you can get away without it. Solving is good, communication is also good.
So if you encounter a question during the interview which you've never seen before and stops you, is it better to take those first 2 minutes to quietly think about it rather than showing the interviewer all the possible brute force approaches you're thinking, or is it better to over-communicate that just so he knows that you are actually thinking of possibilities?
Damned if you do, damned if you don't. This is not a good answer to that, right? So I'll share one scenario as well, is that the candidate is actually the interviewer. Fantastic interview, mostly done. Now the interviewer is asking a question of saying like, how do we actually make this solution more efficient? Like how can we make it more efficient is a question. No idea. So now I'm like, oh, can I use this? Can I do that? Like, I'm trying to build limitation to the system to see if I can come up with the right answer for it. And the interviewer is like, yeah, that might work, but that's like O of 1. But that might work, that's like O of log n. I mean, we've been walking through different aspects, and then finally I'm like, I don't know, you spend like 10 minutes going through different combinations, what is it? And the interviewer gives another option which kind of works out in that particular case. Small thing, it didn't make a difference at the end of the day, but again, it's a very subjective thing. If I had just kept quiet and done nothing, the interviewer has zero outcome, right? At the end of the day, if you keep quiet and deliver nothing, then you're doomed. But if you don't keep quiet and then you don't deliver, then that's okay, because at least the interviewer has like understanding of what you're thinking and can predict whether you will reach it if I give you like 10 extra minutes or 15 extra minutes, right? So I vote more communication. But that being said, I have another example of where like immediately, I come up with wrong information, wrong answer. So here's this graph problem that you need to solve. And then I'm like, oh, I'm going to use the union find on this one. Why? Because I just learned union find last week, right? So I want to use union find, that's all. I found union find, I want to use union find. Like I have a hammer, I find a nail, right? That's what I'm doing. And then the interviewer is like, so for this problem, what is a property that this graph should have for union find to be effective? I'm like, no. Yeah, I know, this particular property doesn't work. I was just too eager, sorry, that's right, it won't work. Let's try this different algorithm. So this, I don't think was a negative experience at all. As far as the interviewer is concerned, the question had all the hallmarks of the union find, except that this associative property was not, like if A is related to B and B is related to C, then A is related to C is not true. And union find requires that. So that property was missing, and that was the only thing that was wrong. Otherwise, it kind of looks very logical, and you can always, you can solve the problem. It sounds reasonable. So as you're going through your data structure, extrapolation and interpretation, this is exactly what you do, right? And it's okay to share that information because that's what I'm thinking. I mean, that's the fact. Now, whether that's going to make me appear stupid in front of the interviewer, I don't know. And if I want to conceal that information, you may make a mistake by actually concealing relevant information. And if I didn't talk to the interviewer at all, and the interviewer didn't coach me, or didn't shine a light on that associative property thing, I would have just gone ahead, 10 steps, because I was super convinced that I can use union find for this. And I would have gone ahead. I would have probably, designed the whole thing and whatnot, and finally, produced a code even. And I was like, but it won't work. At like step 0 was broken for you. So that would have been a problem for me. So these are all like examples from the recent past. So like these things happen very often. Okay? All right. I think we will be about 10 minutes over, like 15 minutes over. So I'll stop at 3:15. Let me just complete the last set, and then we can move on. So the last 2 bits are actually one is like stay calm and brainstorm when you're stuck. Like if you're stuck, right? Panicking is not going to help at all. You'll be way better off actually walking through the question. Like what happens if you're given a question completely out of your league? You have no idea what you're talking about. Like how do you deal with it? What if you know that Dijkstra's is the right answer for this, sort of intuition-wise, but you have no idea what the algorithm is? Some algorithm in that thing is what you know, right? Now what you do is like use the most of what you have. Use all the foundational building blocks that you know, and then come up with a solution ground up based on that. Nobody in their right mind will expect you to invent Kruskal's or Dijkstra's or something else right there in the interview, right? That's not the expectation. Obviously you would have known it. Now if you don't know it, that is the fact. Now the goal here is to figure out what is the best way to communicate what you know and try to evolve from that particular position. Take a step back, think about it, keep calm, like okay, let me take a step back, let me think through this, and here are all the options, and let the interviewer help you through the process. The interviewer's job is to do that, right? Is to actually extract the best in you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing that I observed from practicing the interview recently. It was, I tend to sometimes if I don't know how to solve a problem, I'll jump in and start writing code, and somebody basically told me it's better if you have an idea of what you're going to do before you actually start writing any code at all.
You should have the solution has to be clear enough before you jump into code. And especially when you can't figure it out after you start coding. As you're doing the code, you've already made up your mind on a lot of these decisions that have been made. So you can't switch at that point of time. So spend that time walking through the solution. That makes sense. Right? Go ahead.
So if you're stuck and the interviewer and you expect the interviewer to guide you, but then that doesn't really happen?
What do you do if you're stuck and the interviewer is like refusing to guide you? Like just sitting back, like go, all you, right? And happens, of course, happens all the time. So what do you do? Don't give up, it doesn't make sense. Like you are committed to that 1 hour, right? So go for it. So what I would recommend is like then continue brainstorming, continue going across. Like one of the things there are visual cues, and then there are like verbal cues, right? So what you do is you walk through. It's like, hey, I think I'm going to do this, and I think this will get me to the answer. And the interviewer is like, okay, let me go to the next one. They don't mean to, but they know the answer, so they're like they will give away hints. If the interviewer is like poker face and doing nothing at all, then there's not much. You don't have a whole lot to work with at that point of time. Then all you can do is just brainstorm. All you can do is use your own, right? Play what you have in the interview. Where every now and then you have like a shadow in the room, like you have or a panel interview where you have multiple people, right? Play the audience. Like as you're talking through it, the other person who's sitting over there actually is also trying to solve the problem in his or her mind. Use it to your advantage, because collectively we are smarter than either of us. So let's use that technique. Let me just go and say, this is what I'm going to look and say, does it make sense? No. I always work through that process, and it's harder than it sounds, but it's actually not that difficult. And the only thing that actually trips you up is if you're panicking, if you're super nervous about the interview and things like that, are the things that will make you not bring your A game, not bring your like getting that information out of this particular thing becomes super hard if you're not in a calm state of mind. So interview is the interview. You do your best you do your best when you are actually in a most relaxed state. One of the worst things, unfortunately, this is a setup of the interview as well, is that you have a lot riding on it. To a large case, like for example, someone who's like fresh out of school, a job means a lot, right? It's something. For someone who's actually going from one company to another, usually it's like a huge upgrade. You're going from like a company where you're like in a smaller company, in a smaller role, sometimes like with a huge pay raise and a different city, and your like spouse is already there in the other city, and this means a lot to you, and like I'm desperate to get the job, and things like that. So there's a lot of other aspects that come in, and unfortunately you don't want to get that come in the way of your interviewing. It's easier said than done. It's hard. I totally understand. I mean, I've been looking at this quite often from different angles with different folks, and the more I talk to people, I mean, it is hard. And people do recognize that, specifically when I do campus interviews and college interviews, I see that a lot more. Like the students are reasonably immature, never worked in an industry before, possibly may have 1 or 2 internships. So they really don't know what to do or what to say and how to say it, but that's okay. I mean, as an interviewer, you have to work through them, and putting the candidate at ease is one of the #1 goals for the interviewer. Now, unfortunately, Murphy's Law again, your interviewer might not actually be that adept at doing that, and that may cause more issues. But right, let me cover the last topic which I want to get to was prepare for the AQFM. What is AQFM? Any questions for me? Almost all interviews typically end with any questions for me. Why is this important?
Shows you have interest in the job.
Fair enough. It shows that you're interested in the job. You've done some research. But why is this super important? Like, what if he's like, I have no questions for you? No, I'm done. I've actually asked the hiring manager. I've talked to the recruiter. That's fine. There is absolutely nothing you can say to enlighten me. Is kind of what I'm saying. But is that why is it?
Does it show something about how you solve a real project?
It's one more opportunity for you to make an impression. Recency effect. That's the last thing they're going to remember. So remember that, like we talked about primacy, start big, which is a clarification side of the story, and end high, which is this recency. I have seen, one of the annoying things I've seen, which you may or may not want to do, is I've seen candidates use any questions for me as a way to kind of re-highlight the skills. So they come back and say, so what kind of, give me the traits of a successful manager in your team. And then I'd go over like, hey, a successful manager does this. Like, oh yeah, I have this, and this as well. And then go back and use that as a mechanism to clean up all the loose ends, which is okay. I mean, I think I appreciate it. I have not viewed that negatively, but I find it annoying. I mean, it's like.
So one more opportunity is, you can decide whether the right team for you.
Correct. So this is also, an interview is a two-way process. And specifically it also tells you that you are actually, you're deliberately thinking about your career and options, and it's not like you're desperate to go pick any job that comes your way, right? So you are asking the right kind of questions. So you may not, unfortunately, you may not be in a position where you have the option of actually picking and choosing. But even then, having the questions, like ask questions which are relevant to, which will help you decide whether you want a job or not. Right? I would want to ask you, one of the questions I've had is like, oh, what version control system do you use? Like, oh, we use Git. Oh, thank you. Like, what is this question? It doesn't even make sense. Like, if I had said Subversion, would you actually say, oh, get out of here? No, right? No, I was actually expecting, the question in of itself is not bad. Maybe this is like, this candidate is super passionate about it and might come back and say, oh yes, I have like my fundamental philosophy around this and this is why I like this or something else, right? I need to have a connection as to this should be a make or break to some extent for them. Or it should at least like meaningfully, if everything is hanging at the edge, this should tilt them in one way or the other. More common ones I have seen is in terms of like, how do you prioritize projects? Give me an example of what is a successful project your team has delivered recently. What is the most inventive thing that your team has done? What is the most impactful thing your team has delivered? And things like that. It's a reverse interview for all practical purposes, right? You should ask the same questions and say, like, because I really want to know, because I want to picture myself in your team reporting to you. Now, if I want to do that, like, I want to know what is the most inventive thing. You are my boss, so tell me what is it. Because I want to see myself do that in your team in like 6 months from now or a year from now. So can I actually visualize that? And if the interviewer is not able to provide something, it's like, well, what? And if they get stuck with that, then that gives me more insights into whether I really want to work in that team or not. Because I want people to be excited as well, right? Just as I don't want to just go work in a place where they're like the interviewer does not know what they're doing as well. Like where the team manager does not know what they're doing. Go ahead.
So a question on that. Let's say at the beginning of the interview, you are fully prepared to ask the question, but you didn't do well in the interview. Now the motivation is gone towards the end because you know you haven't done well, mostly the coding interviews. Now, do you ask the question, or do you say fine?
How do you know you have not done well?
Coding question, you right away know that. Okay, you have.
So how do you know that they've actually not asked you to ask a question which was like a Kobayashi Maru thing, impossible task? For people who don't know.
Sometimes it happens, right? That you have given a question, but say you are not able to think through the solution. Sometimes you're given a suboptimal solution, a brute force solution. It works.
How do you know that's not enough? Like my point is that in a continuum of like amazing answer to thing saying, this is a super simple BFS question. I know it. I've done it like hundreds of times. It just didn't strike me, and I did something. It's like a brain fart, and I couldn't solve it. All right, and you're done. Now, is that like curtains for you at that point of time? Not really. The reason why it's not curtains for you is because there are 2 other coding interviews, right? So most likely than not, if you've done well in other ones, it will work. So take each segment of the interview in isolation. Just because I screwed up the previous interview, I don't want to mess up my elevator pitch for the next one, right? Because I start fresh. Maybe the interviewer has information or not, I don't know. Just because I mess up the elevator pitch, do your clarifications bit well. Just because you did the clarification wrong, do the coding well. Just because you did like don't let your interview. You have to find a way to compartmentalize your interview process. It's very hard. It's easier said than done, as I said, but it's not. You have to find a good way to isolate, to bounce back, because when you're playing sports, that's what happens. You lose the previous game, and that actually kind of weighs in on you, and you're not able to play the next game. That's not going to work, right? You have a chance to redeem yourself. The only way you can redeem yourself is like if you're actually bouncing back from that activity. It's the same thing everywhere.
So sometimes I feel taking a water break or kind of a break from doing that kind of talking actually helps me kind of reprioritize and give enough break for the interviewer to kind of also, it's kind of a bi-directional way, and helps me focus on the next step after that.
Fantastic point. Like be calm or keep calm, right? How do you stay calm? How do you do that? Like my mind is raising at 1,000 miles an hour, and I'm like, I know I messed it up. This is like hard. I'm just beating myself up. How do I actually give myself a break? Is like go grab a water, like go get a restroom break, or like do something else which actually can give you that space.
Is it bad to do that after every single round?
Well, then we have a different problem. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to just take this question in a slightly different direction. Instead of saying like, okay, I didn't code so well here, you know, what could I have done better? But not necessarily that, but there's a question I've been thinking of for a while, which is, what are the skills that you think that I could work on or could bring to this job that would make me better fit for the crew? The motivation behind the question is because it gives the interviewer a chance to say, well, I didn't see enough thought leadership here or enough insights there. And then it gives you a chance as the interviewee to be able to say, oh, actually, I didn't highlight my thought leadership, but here's some examples of some thought leadership I did, for example. It gives you a chance to fill in the gaps.
That was a cleanup bit I was talking about. That's exactly, so one of the things that...
But it's a little bit of a dangerous question, so I want to kind of get your take on it, right?
I wouldn't ask a question more around, give me feedback about my performance, is not what you want to allude as at all. A better question which I've seen many people ask is saying, what does a successful candidate look like to you? Like, what are the qualities that are important in a successful candidate? Or like, and not in the same phrasing, but you'd say, hey, as an in-stock product manager in this particular team, what are the things that you look for? What are the top 3 things that they would have to be good at, or something like that, right?
And then it's okay as the interviewee to say, well, actually, I have these, and here's some examples.
So that's the part I find annoying, but I don't feel, I'm not turned off by it, but it's not a negative thing. But I find it annoying because like the whole interview was actually me trying to get that skill out of you. And if I fail to extract that information out of you by asking structured questions, like you telling me that you walk on water at the end of it is not as relevant to me. So it's not great, but at least that but for you it gives you the feedback as to what I'm looking for. Use that for the next interview is what I would say.
The thing is, 1 hour is not long enough to get all, you can't know everything only in 1 hour, it's impossible, right? So it gives you that chance to fill in those gaps. But on the other hand, it doesn't necessarily bond you with the interviewer, right? Like if I ask you instead, like, what is your team culture? You say, blah, blah, blah. I say, oh, great, because I love that kind of culture, because I'm that same kind of person too. Now we bonded, right?
That would be more effective.
That's a more bonding thing. That's why the other question is a little more risky because.
So let me make one statement here. Like the any questions for me is it's an important signal, but I don't think there is anything that you can say that in that particular conversation that will give me the data to actually say that you are good at something or not. Like that's not. It's just another signal. So if I were to say that I need my my engineer to do this quality, and you say, oh yeah, I have that as well, I'm not going to take your word for it. So it's not, so we just spent 45 minutes doing that, right? So that's what I'm going to trust, not this one word that's saying, of course, yeah, I'm good at this as well, right? It's not what, like I've done design, I do large scale design as well, it's not enough for me. But what I do is that I would use that information in the next interview because, oh, I know that you want design, right? Great. Now what I'm going to do is the next time the next interviewer walks in, I'm going to go double down on design and then do that, right? So use the information. So that's a good way of asking the recruiter what's important. So do this before the interviews, because that with the recruiters and with the hiring manager connect and the phone interviews, if at all, so that you have the information you need to come in like, guns blazing or whatever, like bring your A game to the table in the interview, like exactly, like, hit this, right? And you're good at that. So any questions for me is already too late in the game for you to make that kind of an impact. I would use that more to kind of, be the closer, be the finisher. Play to the recency effect more than anything else, right? You had a question in the back.
Yeah, each interviewer is not evaluating their own data points.
They are.
I thought like all 4 interview, each one will be given like you have to evaluate these 2 points.
Every company is different. So I know that there are companies. I think Microsoft does that as well. It asks the first interviewer to evaluate one thing. I think Facebook, as far as I know, actually also has like different names for different interviewers, and if you go Google, you'll find like Jedi, Pirate, and all that names, and those things are actually specifically focused on types of interviews. Amazon does very specific competency assigned interviews. I think Expedia does the same thing. There are like different companies which the process is something you can ask the interviewer, ask the recruiter. The recruiter will walk you through the interview process. If the competencies are different, again the same thing. Right? What are the top 3 qualities? Like design is very important for this role, but I'm not assessing design. It's the next guy or the guy before me or whoever. So rounding the conversation up in that conversation saying I'm good at design is not going to help me as much. So just tying back that question. So the competencies may or may not be assigned.
Okay, in second interview I didn't perform what the data point is evaluating, but in the end somehow I realized that's where I missed. In case I am trying to fulfill those data points in the follow-up interview, still these 2 guys, when they are discussing, I will be successful or?
It depends. So the question is, if I actually, later discover that there was like, hey, the first interviewer was actually trying to figure out, am I inventive enough? Right? Am I actually, quick on my feet and have I thought about something? And then the interviewer goes into the process and saying like, hey, when is the time? And it's very direct. When have you been more inventive? Worked out of a sticky spot? How have you done that? And you couldn't think of an example. And then you go on a break or next interview, you suddenly like, damn, that was a fantastic example, I should have done that, right? Now, what you can do is like see if you can actually relitigate in the next interviewer. With the next interviewer, if you have an opportunity to introduce that concept, like, oh yeah, you know, I was talking to John and he asked me a question like this. I couldn't talk about it, but here is a fantastic use case and whatnot. And you, because at the debrief or at the discussion point, all these guys are talking together. And while it's like telling John about this inventive thing would have been the best opportunity, the fact that you blew it then, you have an opportunity to do it again with somebody else, maybe. But remember, as a part of doing that, you may actually take away from whatever Peter was trying to do, right? So don't play catch up. Then you will not be answering Peter's questions, and then you have to go to Tom's questions. And so that doesn't work. At some point, so you don't want to play catch up, and it's sometimes easier to just like compartmentalize, move on, and then carry on, right? And reflect with the recruiter afterwards. Like, hey, here's what happened in my interview. This is what I thought. You would actually be surprised. Many companies, recruiters do play a more significant role than you think otherwise. They are just not this glorified folks who are just there to keep the meeting rooms and other things assigned. They are actually they're an essential part of the recruitment process. So a conversation that you have with a recruiter is very meaningful. Sometimes you may end up revealing more than you should about your motivations and intents and what is important to you or not, and sometimes you may actually not use them effectively enough to actually cover up for the gaps that you've made. You blow up a coding
interview. Do that? Like who talks to recruiters?
Every candidate talks to a recruiter at some point. Amazon you do, Facebook you do, Google you do, Expedia you do.
Because the recruiters that I've talked to, like, I mean, Google recruiter I talked to, like, I just couldn't see that person having any kind of voice in the room.
You would be surprised,
but I say that politely, but
no, fair enough. No, I hear you, but I'm looking at I work at Amazon, and I'm looking at Amazon recruiters actually have a significant say to a point where in different interviews we have conversations that are like, why is that recruiter trying to oversell this candidate? Like, no, he or she was not a part of the interview loop. I don't want them to influence the decision. But the recruiter is like, I'm the candidate's voice in this room. We are customer obsessed, customer first, and I want to make sure that we're making the right decision. And sometimes it's the recruiter who's like your active voice in the whole conversation. I mean, everybody should be, but it's the recruiters. But I have a super positive view because almost all the recruiters that I've worked with I try to look at the best in people.
So. Can you maybe answer the question differently? You're at Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
You guys sit in the room when it's all said and done. Is the recruiter in that room with you?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
The recruiter is always there in the debrief. They are the note takers of the debrief. And they are the ones who are recording the information, and they are the ones who actually carry this forward. So if we decide that you're not it this time, and then we'll probably retry talking to you like maybe 6 months to let you grow in one area, they are the ones who have the onus of actually providing you the feedback in a semi-anonymous way, or the specific way, in a way that's actually not, hey, you in your conversation with Tom, you said this, and that, so it won't be that specific. It'll be like, hey, why don't you actually practice on your coding skills and then come back in 6 months, that'll probably make more sense. And that's it. And they have the power to do that, or send you an email saying, hey, it was nice talking to you, we should talk later, or something like that.
That's good information, because what I found in 95% of the cases is that if you don't pass the interview, the recruiters don't even have the common courtesy to email you back and tell you anything these days.
Yeah,
sure.
I agree with that.
Right?
All right,
it's
so
horrible out there, right?
what I will do is, just in the interest of time, I think I want to stop this conversation, I'll stop the recording, and then we can continue with Q&A for another